I want to tell everyone thank you so much for coming today. I know it's finals week, end of semester, everybody's really busy, so I know we can appreciate and Gayle appreciates you all showing up today. So Gayle Gifford is a 20-year nonprofit veteran and a 30-year Great Falls native. So she's going to be talking a little bit today and debunking some of the greater myths of nonprofits. So please just sit back, enjoy your pizza, and let me introduce Gayle.
Well, thanks so much for letting me come here today. I was given the lofty topic of nonprofits and entrepreneurship and how it all links in there. Trying to figure out exactly how to tackle that because I've done full semesters on just segments of nonprofits. So the best thing I could come up with is probably addressing some of the top 10 myths of nonprofits. Everything ranging from employment opportunities to skill levels to financing and some innovative ways that nonprofits are functioning these days. So if there's anything there that you're interested in getting some more on, let me know. But in the meantime, we'll start with this. And I do have some handouts that went around that you've got the PowerPoints. And then one little interesting piece is future entrepreneurs that you might be interested in seeing is the L3C concepts. And we'll go into that just a little bit today. So informal, stop me if you have any questions because I would love to share with you any bits of information that I have. And I assume because I was talking to the IT guy, I have 20 years experience in the nonprofit sector. Just recently moved to Missoula in the last 10 months now, I guess it's been, working with the food bank here, had 6 years of food banking back in Great Falls, and then the rest of the time within the nonprofit sector was dealing in programs that dealt with high-risk youth. So there was domestic violence shelter and youth risk prevention programs. So kind of have been in different levels from very small shop to 1 or 2, 3 people to my current organization has 17 staff members. We're a statewide organization. We deal with the entire state of Montana, delivering food to 200 partner agencies. So that kind of gives you a perspective of from little teeny organizations to much larger even than what we have here in the state of Montana. Let's see. What kind of impact do nonprofits have in this state? And this is national and Montana records. There are 1.8 million registered IRS tax-exempt organizations. That's a lot of nonprofits nationally. Within Montana, we have about 6,400. Within Missoula, there is probably about 800, which is exceedingly high. But believe it or not, we have the misperception here in Missoula that we have the highest number of nonprofits per capita, and we don't. Actually, Helena beats us out because of all of the different political organizations that they have. A lot of the statewide associations are based out of Helena. So it was kind of a surprise to me, too, that while there's not in numbers, there's a lot more nonprofits there per person than there are here in Missoula. But we still have a lot of nonprofits. Not every one of them have paid staff. There's a lot of nonprofits that have just volunteers that work there. So there's all that level as well, and some of you may already volunteer at some of them. Nationally, about 6.6 million people work within the nonprofit sector in Montana here. It's a little over 10% of the workforce. So I think as we started to kind of rally together probably about 15 years ago as a nonprofit sector, we started to realize that we're not really the small players that I think everybody perceives us to be. Charities are the needy group, and we always have to work harder for everything that we get, and we're not always thought as being as highly skilled, highly qualified, all those things. We're the fourth stepchild in the business sector. So when we started taking a look at how many people are employed and the economic impact that we have in the state, we kind of started to stand up a little bit taller and realize that we do have a voice, and we are pretty strong in our organizations and within the state. So $1.5 billion in wage contributions into Montana. So we're certainly not someone to be ignored. I think it's just definitely we need to step up and have a voice, though. So the number one nonprofit is that nonprofits can't earn a profit. Now, we don't have investors. We have to be available for public benefit, not for private investors. So a healthy nonprofit will make a profit every year. The difference is our profits aren't going out to shareholders or other stakeholders. They are going right back into the mission. And so most large organizations, nonprofits in Montana will be making a significant profit. I know our organization does fairly well, and then that goes into having operating reserves and making yourself a little more self-sustaining, a little more stable, so you don't constantly have to be out there begging for the dollars, but actually be out there addressing your mission and offering your mission. The standards for operating reserves typically are around 6 months. That a lot of organizations, that's their comfort zone, is to have 6 months of operating expenses in the bank. Our organization, because of our national affiliations, we have to have at least 3 months reserves. To me, that's not enough. And basically that means do we have enough money to continue to pay overhead, pay salaries, continue our business as is, and we have absolutely no cash flow in at all. So again, 6 months is the comfort zone. Some will have up to a year. But then we sit there on the fence as a nonprofit is if we are sitting on a year's worth of operating reserves, are we truly taking our revenue and our donors and all of that money and adequately putting it into our mission, or are we keeping it in the bank just so we have a nice balance sheet? So we kind of sit in that weird, we're a for-profit. The more money you have in the bank, the better the investors and the better your stakeholders feel. For us, it's not always that benefit. So there is that tipping point of having too much money in the bank, and we need to invest that back into our programming. It means you've got a really good development staff that has been out there in the bushes and getting the funding. One of the new things that, well, I shouldn't say new, it's been around since about 2008, is the low-profit limited liability company. And I handed out some information. Rural Dynamics was kind of the driving force, I think it was 2 legislative sessions ago now, to have this particular corporate form approved here in the state of Montana. Currently, I guess it started in 2008 in Vermont, and it now has spread to, I think, like 8 or 10 different states, and a tribal nation in North Dakota, and also the Crow Nation here in Montana. And what the L3C is it's a hybrid nonprofit for-profit. So it's really an exciting kind of a concept that we're starting to look at in nonprofits, because it allows us to address our social mission and address our social cause and still have investors and still have an acceptable revenue stream. So everything that an L3C makes has to be reinvested back into the social cause for which they're after, for what their mission is. But then they can also invite program-related investors to come in. There's a lot of foundations that like to do that. They can have stakeholders that do invest in the organization, and they can sort of give them back, or they have some benefits of that. A couple things that they give up is that they are not tax exempt. The IRS restricts their profits, so it's not truly a for-profit where they can really go nuts and make a lot of money. It does have to go back into their mission. So there is some restrictions on that. There is no lobbying or political activities at all, and that will be another myth that we'll address on down the line, that nonprofits can do that. And again, the revenue must be used for a social cause. It was really designed to encourage program or PRI, program-related investments. And one of the benefits of PRI is foundations, private foundations, have an IRS requirement that they have to distribute at least 5% of their assets annually. They can't just sit on this money. And private foundations are typically corporate foundations or family foundations. You've heard the Washington Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They have an IRS requirement that 5% of their assets have to be handed out in the form of grants. But it can also be handed out in the form of investments. And so it can be a short-term loan or an investment to an L3C, which the benefit of that is they meet their 5% compliance, and yet it is coming back to them in the form of repayments later on. So they don't totally lose that asset altogether. It will continue to come back. So the L3C is very, very attractive for that private foundation that likes to do investments but not necessarily rent everything out. Again, Vermont was the starter of all of this, but it is in other locations, and it's not to be confused with social enterprise. And that was one of the things I think we talked out on the phone is social entrepreneurship. A social enterprise is someone who has a social cause that might benefit by being either a for-profit or nonprofit. and it would be, depending on their source of revenue and those types of things. Those are groups like co-ops, associations, a lot of community development organizations, because they can provide low interest loans or no interest loans out to students for student loans or for home builders or things like that. Sometimes you'll see in the nation, NeighborWorks is another one, if you've ever heard of that, kind of planting homes for low-income families. They provide them with low-income loans in order to do this, and that's a really good blend for a social enterprise type of a nonprofit, possibly for-profit. So an L3C is a hybrid of both of them, where a social enterprise is one or the other. So they're not getting all of the benefits of being a nonprofit. They establish themselves as a for-profit. And there's all kinds of interesting information on the website to take a look at. The second one is nonprofits can't lobby. And it is a fine line, but we can lobby. What we can't do is do basically undue influence on any political campaigns or decisions. So we can't invest in a campaign fund. We can't do that. But we can go out and educate our legislators in making sure that whatever our mission is and our information is provided to them to help make them better knowledgeable about voting on certain issues. We're going through that right now with the Farm Bill. We actually hired a consultant, and that individual is campaigning Senator Baucus and his constituents on a day-to-day basis in their face, trying to get them to understand and be educated about the issues around the nutrition and Farm Bill for supplemental nutrition of food stamps and emergency assistance programs and all of those things. So we're not paying anybody to vote a certain way. We are just making very sure that the people that are on that committee are very well educated about the needs of not only Montana, but throughout the nation. So each one of us are kind of hitting on our local representatives that are serving on that committee. So that's just one example. Obviously, we can go to Helena when they're in the legislature, we can campaign there, we can educate there. We just can't do any undue influence is basically the way that they term that. There is also a limited amount of resources that we can direct to lobbying, and that is varying upon the size of your budget. So in our case, what we try to do is stay right below the threshold, because if you do go over that threshold, you need to report to the IRS all of your political activities. And we try not to do that, but we have paid policy staff, we have money that's directed towards those efforts, but we stay just under the threshold so that we don't need to complicate matters with reporting to the IRS every single political process that we go through and whatever we do. So there's ways of circumventing it, but yes, you can still lobby, and that's one of the big misperceptions of nonprofits. The next one is nonprofits should not have high overhead costs. This is kind of a pet peeve of mine. A lot of organizations pride themselves on the fact that we keep our administrative dollars down to about 7% of our budget. That's what our organization. And as I come in here and go, well, that's all well and good. But in the meantime, we've got staff that is making enough to qualify for food stamps. The same thing that we're trying to make not happen. We're arguing for equitable wages and trying to get these people out of the hole. So, that is kind of that conundrum that we sit in, is we want to keep our overhead low, but not so low that our own staff people don't make the cut. I have a video that I'm going to take just a minute. If you guys ever watch TED Talks, I don't know if any of you have ever watched any videos from that. I'm a big fan of TED Talks, and so this one in particular, Dan Pallotta has really kind of gotten out there and in everybody's face about this, and hopefully I can get What was that? On the scroll thing down at the screen? Because I didn't get the subtitles.
Now, I also happen to be gay.
Did you hear enough of it?
Being gay and fathering triplets is by far the most socially innovative, socially entrepreneurial thing I have ever done.
Put your microphone by the computer.
Well, that's something oh, for the camera?
Yeah.
Before I do that, I want to ask if we even believe that the nonprofit sector has any serious role to play in changing the world. A lot of people say now that business will lift up the developing economies and social business will take care of the rest. I believe that business will move the very mass of humanity forward. But it always leaves behind that 10% or more that is most disadvantaged or unlucky. And social business needs markets, and there are some issues for which you just can't develop the kind of money measures that you need for a market. I sit on the board of the Center for the Developmentally Disabled. These people want laughter, compassion, and they want love. I monetize that. And that's where the nonprofit sector and philanthropy come in. Philanthropy is the market for love. It is the market for all those people for whom there is no other market coming. And so if we really want, like what Mr. Fuller said, a world that works for everyone, no one and nothing left out, then the nonprofit sector has to be a serious part of the conversation. But it doesn't seem to be working. Why have our breast cancer charities not come close to finding a cure for breast cancer, or our homeless charities not come close to ending homelessness in any major city? Why does poverty remain stuck at 12% of the U.S. population for 40 years? And the answer is, these social problems are massive in scale. Our organizations are tiny up
watch that. But I think it just gives you an idea of some of the constraints that nonprofits get under, and a lot of it is dictated by our donors. If I were to have $1 for every time a donor called me and said, quit sending me all that mail, I don't want my donation going to postage. Well, if they only knew, that is a huge, huge percentage of a nonprofit's income is that direct mail. So if you don't get the mail and you don't make your gift, it's that whole confusion that we have. So a lot of times we are dictated to by our donors of, don't spend my donated dollars on that. Well, it's all a vicious cycle in order to, we have the money to do the social cause, and really for what it costs us to send those things out is pennies on the dollar, and your donation is still going towards that. So that is a trend that is changing, and I'm really, really glad after 20 years of being in nonprofits to hear finally that there is no pride in having 7% administrative costs. It's okay. The industry standard typically is around 12%. That one is kind of acceptable. You're maybe pushing the limit a little bit. And there's even some giving campaigns that will not allow us to participate if we have higher levels of administrative costs. So you kind of have to weigh out, and the expense of turnover and everything else, you've got to weigh out what's going to be to your advantage on that. So the high overhead costs, I'm so glad to see that particular myth being busted, quite frankly. Getting back to my slide presentation.
Gayle, what kind of return do you see as far as email marketing compared to your direct mail?
Well, right now, email in Montana is not very strong as far as what we see. It's probably less than 1% of our online giving is a result of email campaigning. So we're starting to see online giving go up. It's probably about 12% of our total private donations, public donation type things coming in. We have a pretty aggressive direct mail campaign that we do. And so out of a $10 million budget, I'd say probably $1.5 million comes from direct mail. So it's a pretty significant for us. Again, we do statewide. And out of that, less than 1% is really done through email campaigning. That's something that our organization is growing on because we've not collected email addresses. I mean, when we do our direct mail campaign, it's based on our donor database plus those that we acquire, through purchasing or in other ways. So that collection of email is you have to have a relationship before you get that email. And then once we have it now, we're starting to do a lot more email outreach for donations. We're also starting to explore, well, for one thing we found is our donation capacity is great on a computer, but if you try to do it on a cell phone or a tablet, it's not working out very well. So we're trying to do some programming in that so that it's, donations are going up on cell phone, smartphones more and more. That's becoming everybody's computer of choice. So we're trying to make sure that our access is compatible with that. And then, of course, you always hear about when there's a disaster, you could make a donation using your cell phone and texting. You text this number to whatever it is, and you can make a $10 donation off of your cell phone. So that is another access that we're taking a look at. But in Montana, online and email giving is pretty low. But in other states, you're seeing it a little bit more. But it is growing. I think more and more we're starting to see people a lot more confident making online gifts. So another misperception is that nonprofits get most of their funding from foundations. And while foundations are great friends of ours, actually it's that individual donor that I was telling you about. Our organization, of course, we don't have any corporate contracts or anything like that, so we are primarily off of individuals. Foundations and corporations probably come in second, and then bequests there at the bottom. Bequests take a long time. It can take 7 years to nurture, a bequest, so it takes quite some time to get to that point, and it's one of those bittersweet type of gifts that we get coming in because we wouldn't have happened unless someone passed away. So individual donations is really where it's at, and although the economy has been struggling and supposedly recovering for the last year, donations didn't really slack off a whole lot. So private donations are individuals are really stepping up to the plate, and where foundations tend to have some challenges because their assets may be invested in such a way that the market affected, so their giving was lower, and those types of things can really take that into play. Within our own structure and our own budgets, most of our money goes to program services, or comes from program services and contracts, which the program services goes back to, we can't make a profit. Well, they can charge for their services. You'll see a lot of nonprofits that'll have a sliding scale based on your income, but it is okay for us to charge for our services. And that's kind of a change that we've seen over the time too, because for a long time it was, well, you can't charge for this. You're doing things with, with poor people. You can't charge them. Well, there's a certain amount of buy-in and commitment from individuals where they have, even if they have to put up $5 for the service versus absolutely nothing at all. A certain amount of pride. They're not getting charity. So, nonprofits are pretty darn flexible. They'll work with people that don't have the money at all. But if you can, there's, again, certain commitment and accountability when you have to put something down for those services. The next one comes from grants and contributions and gifts. That is, it's obviously a really big source for us. And then, special events, which, Montana and Missoula, if you look at the calendar in the paper every weekend, you see all these events after event after event. Well, the net proceeds from those are not that wonderful in a lot of cases. We just made a conscious decision today to drop an event because consistently we were only making $2,000 in net income, and that was a $15,000 gross income event. The expenses were high enough; it just didn't make sense. Plus, all of that doesn't account for staff time and the space that it takes up when you could be doing something that's more productive.
When doing special events, is the advertising and the getting your name out there, does that ever, is it ever worth the balance of gross income to net income?
We tend to, well, first of all, radio stations and television stations have a certain amount of free time that they have to give away. The FCC requires that, so there's a lot of PSA time. But like he said, 4 in the morning, kind of crappy stuff. But what you will get them to do a lot of times is do an in-kind donation, and they will either contribute all or half of your advertising. So if you buy $500 worth, they'll donate $500 worth. So the advertising helps a bit. And particularly events where general public can go to, that's where advertising really pays off. And if you have the right connections and you can finagle it, it doesn't have to be a big cost in your event.
So generating awareness through the event is worth more than generating dollars.
And that can be the case too, and that's something we talk about is, are we raising awareness or are we raising money? A fundraiser versus a fundraiser. Mm-hmm. And those are the other things that you have to weigh out. And like this event today, while it created awareness, it wasn't nearly as impactful as some other manner that we have in creating awareness. It's kind of lost that. So, you do have to kind of weigh that out as well as to whether your investment is worth it in the long run. And that's something we survey with all of our online gift is, how did you hear about us? Was it through a direct mail campaign and you just decided instead of mailing a check-in, you go online and make your gift? Or did you come to one of our events and then that generate a gift later on? So yeah, those are all the factors that you have to weigh out, is whether the publicity and the awareness is well worth the cost of the event. So another one is you have to starve to work in the nonprofit sector. And while you probably do have to compromise a little bit, you're not going to make $400,000 a year like a CEO of a for-profit. That's a given. On the flip side, in nonprofits, I think we pride ourselves on being family-oriented, being very, very flexible. You have a lot of latitude to, maybe possibly do some telecommuting, working at home, so those kinds of things really do play into it, and I think is a really big reason why I continue to stay in nonprofits. One thing, I've tried for-profits, and when my mission is revenue, that just isn't a driving motivation for me. My mission needs to be a social cause, and so, that's one of my big reasons for being in that. So if that's something you're all on board with, that's, amazing. I brought up just off of the Montana Nonprofit Association has a compensation report that they did. And just some of the more key positions within a nonprofit, just so you can kind of get an idea. And it is really based on the size of the organization. So obviously a much larger organization is able to pay much more for their key people. But you know, if the smaller the organization, the less that you're going to have, but of course there's a lot less demands and all of that go along with it. So do you have to start to work in the nonprofit sector? No. Will you probably compromise it if you were to work in the for-profit sector on a salary basis? Absolutely, but on a intrinsic rewards, no. I mean, it is, I've worked in the for-profit sector. I was making a lot more than what I make now, but I clocked in at 8, I clocked out at 5, I had 1 hour lunch whether I wanted it or not, even if I was in the middle of a project. It was very, very stringent, and there was no leeway of, well, go to your child's events and then come back and finish out your work, or make up for it next week or whatever. There was no flexibility in the corporate world at all. Not saying every corporation is like that, but that has a tendency to be more so in the nonprofit sector. So basically, for the most part, these particular positions probably make at least the Montana median versus being less. There's not very many that are actually less than $45,000 a year. Well, this is the other one that I also have a pet peeve with, and that's nonprofits aren't well managed. And maybe it's because of my position, but for a long, long time, there was always this misperception that somehow the CEO of a nonprofit or of a for-profit was better educated, better experienced, able to handle the big things, So the guy that's running Ford Motor Company is far more capable than the nonprofit or CEO. And that has always been a pet peeve of mine. The trend typically is, at least in leadership positions, a lot of nonprofit executive directors and CEOs are retired from the for-profit sector. They've had enough, and they want to go work and do something that is meaningful to them and to their community. And so they are highly educated and highly experienced and highly trained. The other piece of that is we can't just run our organization like a little mom and pop shop. We have the same regulations, if not, they're increasing more and more all the time, and then for-profits do. So there's, of course, the overhead myth, and we have to be held accountable to our donors. There's regulatory changes that are occurring, and a lot more scrutiny through the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. Those things are being more financial scrutinized. More eyes on executive compensation. You've probably seen scandals where Red Cross is paying $300,000 or $400,000 a year in perks and so on to their leadership. And then transparency and accountability. Everybody in their Uncle Fred is looking at a nonprofit and how they spend their money. You don't get a for-profit that much scrutinized. The stakeholders, as long as they're getting their benefits and they're getting their dividends, they're fine with it. So they don't care about all the rest of it. So management is as good or sometimes even better than for-profits. I mean, just like in any other sector, you have goods and bads. Work is not challenging in nonprofits. That's another one I hear all the time. One of the nice perks of working in a nonprofit is diversity. My job is different every single day. And even though I'm a CEO, I have been known to go out in the warehouse and clean something up. I can also do leadership. So you're really very diverse all over the place every day. You become very skilled at doing a lot with a little. So again, your accountability is scrutinized. You need to make sure that everything that you do is highly reviewed and making sure that you're spending your money appropriately. Within the nonprofit sector, I think entry level has great growth potential. So there's definitely some challenge that goes along with that, and coming up with some great programming ideas or cost-saving ideas that you will be recognized because you're not lost in that corporate structure. And also a high value of business skills. And that, again, is another change you're starting to see in nonprofits. When I started 20 years ago, I was a real anomaly. I had a business degree. I wasn't a social worker. I didn't offer program services in the past. I had not done that sort of a thing. I had an accounting and a business degree. And that was really, really unusual. But more and more now, they're finding the value of running a social work type organization but having a business background. So, your MBA and entrepreneurship capabilities are definitely going to go far in the nonprofit sector. The other one is that they're run by consensus and they have non-hierarchical structures. That's not true. I mean, they're just as organized and they have organizational structures as for-profits do. While their teamwork is probably heavily emphasized, probably more so than in for-profit sectors, The ultimate decision does lie with management. They're very, very mission-focused, and organizational structures have a tendency, instead of being very wide and shallow, like you can see where you've got a lot of manager positions, they have a tendency to be very narrow and deep. So there is a lot of room to grow up in a nonprofit organization. 9 is nonprofits tend to hire anybody that they can get their hands on, and that's not true either, because it's expensive to hire an employee who, you go through all the effort of training and they don't fit your organization, they don't fit the job, they don't have the skills, that they portrayed to have through the interview process. So we have a tendency to be very, very selective. Again, entry-level positions, but not necessarily. If you've got the experience, you can certainly head right into management or upper management positions. I did list some websites that might be helpful for you if you're at all interested in looking for positions. One thing about nonprofits that you'll see is a lot of times they will bring in interns, and then you could very well get hired. If you've ever looked at the VISTA, AmeriCorps VISTA program, nonprofits benefit from a lot of AmeriCorps VISTAs, and a lot of times you get hired afterwards if you do an awesome job. We always have anywhere from 2 to 5 VISTAs in our organization, so that's a good opportunity to get your foot in the door. And then last but not least, every nonprofit works around social work, and that's not true either. I took a look just to see, human services are out there, 15% of the nonprofits are doing social work. There's recreation and sports, so if that's your interest. There's mental health, there's a lot of health associations, and hospitals are nonprofits, and arts and environment. And so, there's just a wealth of things. You don't need to be a social worker. I'm not a social worker, but I worked in a shelter. I learned that. If I didn't know it before, I learned that. But there's a lot of room to explore your passion and your interest in doing all of that.
Yeah, what would be considered a research for nonprofit? Down there, way at the bottom, 1% is research.
For research?
Yeah.
There are, I would say, like an educational institution that does research or does studies. I'm trying to think, like McLaughlin Center in Great Falls is a nonprofit. Huge research facility. I don't know, you've got one that's kind of compatible around here, and I can't remember the name of it now, whether that's a nonprofit or not. I just went through a couple of organizations in Bozeman that were nonprofits, and they're doing research and helping to find cures for diseases. So if you're a biologist or a chemist or anything like that, you can certainly work within the nonprofit sector and receive all those benefits and still be able to use your degrees. So that's pretty much where the research is going to come into. And that is the end. So now 20 years worth of nonprofit experience. Any questions that you have, or curiosities, or?
How long ago about starting? How do they really form?
First, you need to make sure that you're mission-based. You have some social cause that's in it, and the IRS has great tools on their website that will help you establish your criteria. And really, what it takes initially is they have a 20-page application that you need to fill out. And it's not just, what's your name and what are you going to do. You need to literally go through and do some strategic planning and establish what your goals and objectives are going to be for this organization, at least projecting for the next 3 years. If you've had any donations or revenue in the past, you utilize that because there is some financials that they ask you to project, almost like a business plan. They want you to project where your income is going to come and where you're going to be receiving some of your proceeds in the future, all within a 3 years time, either 3 years forward or maybe a year or two back and 1 year forward, those types of things. And then you submit that to the IRS. It usually takes about 6 months before you receive any kind of word, let alone a determination. The whole process can take up to a year, but I've been hearing around 6 or 8 months is how long it takes before you get that.
And how does that compare with you say it's hard in starting your own business?
For one thing, when you're starting your own business, you got to have a business plan up front, and then you got to hit the ground looking for money. And so you're trying to sell that business. From a nonprofit perspective, you can actually do it if you're not looking for an income without any money. And when you have your nonprofit, your tax exempt application into the IRS, the day that you receive the letter saying we've received your application, you can now go out and get funding from foundations and those types of things with your application pending. So some foundations may just go ahead and invest in you, and if your nonprofit status doesn't come through, then you got to pay the money back. Or they may just say, hey, when you get the letter from the IRS, then we'll give you the grant. So you can actually start doing your fundraising before you actually have your designation. So from the for-profit, nonprofit standpoint, I would think that would be the toughest part with the for-profit is you've got to go out there and find the money before you can even do what you want to do. Because it's going to take the money to be able to do that. So there may be some easier entrances into nonprofits than there are, but you do have some restrictions, probably more so than obviously more so than for-profits. Did I answer your question? Okay.
So that sounds kind of similar as far as before you start a business, you should have some customers first.
Well, yeah, you know, and usually when people head into a nonprofit, it's because they're already doing something in that line, and maybe they're working with another nonprofit, but it's just not a direction that nonprofit wants to go, and so they come up with this idea, and they've already kind of sort of been working on it, and they think they're going to pull together this structure. Perfect example is the Montana Food Bank Network a couple of years ago got a bill passed that allowed a legislative group to study childhood hunger in Montana. And it formed a group of legislators that did this review along with some community members that participated, and they called themselves the Montana Partnership to End Childhood Hunger. And what they did is we served as their fiscal sponsor, which is a temporary sort of a thing, allowed them to make all these donations coming in under our tax exempt status. So they've been doing the work for about a year and a half now. Now they're at that turning point because the fiscal sponsorship is about to expire here in a couple of days to decide, do we continue under as a program of some organization, or do we spin off on our own? Are we becoming that big of a deal now where we have our own funding streams? We could potentially, get staff, but not necessarily. And do we want to be independent, or are we better off with a program with another organization and being absorbed into all of their processes? So a lot of times nonprofits will spring off of groups just like that. They've already been doing their work. So customer base, yeah, they probably already have some of their things already rolling before they even decide to be a nonprofit.
So I know in other states, I don't think because it's not Montana yet, there are B corporations, which are limited project corporations. They sound similar to the 3C type of corporation. Do you know the difference between those two is?
Well, an LLC is what you're thinking of probably, and the L3C is very similar to an LLC, but it's a hybrid for-profit, nonprofit, where the LLC that you're thinking of is just a for-profit organization. So there's some, obviously they're not tax exempt, but they can take donations, those types of things you can do, where a straight flat out LLC is a little different. So it is really a subsection, an IRS subsection of an LLC.
So we're looking at the form to start a nonprofit. It seems you start you incorporate normally as a C Corp or an LLC or another corporation, and then you apply for nonprofit status, and then even further 501c3 status. Is that
right? Well, you have to be a corporation. You can't be a partnership or even a sole proprietor or anything like that. You actually have to be registered. Don't say it. Okay, sorry. You actually have to be a registered corporation with that state. So that's usually your first step, and that's a pretty easy, short little filing fee. And then we do have to continue at each year. We have to renew our corporate status. And that little glitch is sometimes what hurts a lot of nonprofits, because you can keep your IRS tax exempt status rolling and lose your corporate status because you forgot to renew it this year. And so, that can be then if you're going to have employees, the workers' comp issue, and there's all kinds of other issues that go along with it. So you leave yourself open to a lot of liability. So yes, all nonprofits have a corporate filing with the state.
So you're speaking of myths. Now, is it a myth it's more to start up a hybrid than it is to start either a profit or nonprofit? Because I have heard that investors might not be as familiar or experienced with hybrid corporations, and that they might hesitate.
Yeah.
What's your feedback on
L3Cs,
that?
the hybrid is still a pretty new thing. You see that not very many states are doing it. And actually handout that you have from Rural Dynamics or Rural Development or whatever it is, Tom Jacobson is a legislator, and he is the CEO of this organization and really drove that through the legislation 2 years ago. And it was just too ambiguous for a lot of the legislators, and they just did not embrace it as being an option, a corporate structure option here in Montana. So it's still new enough, and there are some investors that are still a little skittish about it because there is risk involved. You know, you've got the risk that they're going to be paid back, and it doesn't just turn into a grant situation. And so it's still new enough and still risky enough that it is not fully embraced by everybody. And not every organization is going to fit. Again, another example is our use this with our corn organization is we used to have a cannery. And we would take food that we would get that needed to be processed and kept for a period of time, and we would send it to the cannery, and they would can it, and then it becomes shelf stable. It's no longer perishable. Well, that would have been a perfect L3C structure because not only was it being done for a charitable and social benefit, the food that came out of that cannery would go to food banks throughout the state, but it also had a retail option out of it where we could have sold that product to grocery stores and made profit off of it. So it would have been a beautiful blend of that. Investment opportunities, you know, all kinds of things could have come out of that. But again, with no ability, that corporate structure, that kind of came to an end. But yeah, it's still not totally embraced. I think it's awesome. I really, really do.
And the second part to that, is it possible and feasible for a corporation that starts as a for-profit to then transition to be an L3C or a B corporation at a later time?
Yeah, you probably could, and that was that social enterprise that I kind of alluded to into that. A social enterprise can either be a nonprofit or a for-profit. It can't be a hybrid. But there's no reason why you couldn't start as a for-profit, and then, you know, even a social enterprise is going to have some sort of mission, social cause-based purpose for being in existence. They're just making profit and have shareholders are possibly involved in that. So they could transition to that later on. Then the emphasis would need to be more on the social cause than the revenue. So yeah, there is that possibility on down the line. If you set up a for-profit in Montana and L3C becomes adaptable in 5 to 10 years, you can switch to that. I think that would still be an option.
Thank you.
While the questions coming back there, we've got a few of the Missoula Sentinel DECA students here. Would you mind explaining kind of the conversation we had about volunteer opportunities that we were kind of working with the Entrepreneurship Club and Missoula DECA, what those projects you were talking about were,
Right.
just kind of thing?
Yeah. We've had a lot of groups, whether they are businesses, there's a couple businesses that allow their employees to have so many hours a month off paid and they come over and volunteer for us, or we get a lot of youth groups that come through, those types of things. So rather than, I mean, there's obviously wonderful opportunities in like the Missoula Food Bank and those types of organizations to do the direct service, but if that's not necessarily your cup of tea. The Montana Food Bank Network has a very sizable warehouse, and what we are is a distribution center for food banks throughout the state, so we don't do direct distribution. But we have 2 programs that are pretty volunteer intense, and we have a lot of volunteers that come in daily to do that, and we'd love to offer that opportunity to you. One is we have a repack room. And what we do is we buy bulk product, 300-pound bags of cereal or 500-pound bags of potato chips or crackers or something like that. And then we break them down and put them into bags in consumer size. And then those get sent out to the agencies. And that's a really kind of a neat assembly line process where you can take these bulk products and break them down into regular size bags and seal them up and everything else. The other new program that we're initiating is called Mail a Meal. We have areas in the state of Montana that are really, really challenging to get to. The far eastern states, it can be a 7-8 hour drive for us to get there. And we have a fleet of trucks, but it's still, we look at the cost benefit of going all the way to Sydney to serve 10 families. Not that those 10 families are important, but we're going to be spending a ton of money to get there to serve those 10 families, and can we do that every single month? So we are developing boxes that have 21 meals in it for a family of 2, and we'll send multiple boxes if you have larger families. And we're working with churches to be able to drop ship those boxes off so they can distribute them, and we don't even have to go there. So we're just getting that rolling. We have the food and we need a big crew of volunteers. Again, assembly line process. We just shove the box down the assembly line and everybody puts their product in there, seals it up, puts it on a pallet, and then we're ready to ship it. So we have, it seems to be a kind of a job that everybody likes to do. It feels very productive, and it is. You can look behind you and see when you've got all this work done. And yet it takes away some of that direct service working in a soup kitchen if you're not comfortable with that. You know, so it really is a cool opportunity. I gave Austin the name of the woman. If you guys decide you want to come and do a community service project, and you know, try it out once, and we'll set you up with it for a couple of hours. And then if you want to make it a regular thing, we can certainly work that out for you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. Anything else? Did you remember your question?
I did remember my question. My question was, is it lead on starting a nonprofit? Is the L3C quicker? Yeah, I guess you don't have. You're not getting a tax exempt status. I guess is establishing an L3C like establishing an LLC where you just send out $100?
Yeah, well, and remember, L3Cs are not, they're not tax exempt, so any donations to them, you don't get that tax write-off. So really, it appeals more to investors who are going to make that money back later on in the future. Where with it, you know, so the setup for an L3C until they get all of the logistics down is going to be, I mean, you're going to have to kind of do the best of both worlds, I would imagine. It's going to have some nonprofit element to it, so the IRS is going to need to sanction it, but the for-profit side of it is more the corporate structure within the state. So those logistics are a state-by-state basis, except for the IRS's involvement is always going to be the same. So yeah, it's probably going to be a little more complicated to set those up, and I would imagine the scrutiny is going to be a lot tighter because, again, they've got limitations on how much money they can raise and their revenues, and you know, it's not like for-profit endless amount that you can make. So there may be some more constraints on that and setting it up. Where the nonprofit is pretty, you either meet the qualifications or you don't. You know, you're either a 501c3 classification or you're not. So those are pretty easy determinations to make. We can turn over that pretty quickly. Did that answer you? Okay.
So I'm still confused. Is an L3C approved in Montana yet or not?
No.
It's not.
Only on the Crow Reservation.
Right. Okay.
So Montana does not have it yet. We're just not that progressive.
And is Rural Dynamics leading the charge to get it implemented, or is there some other group?
Well, Rural Dynamics has really been doing that, and Tom Jacobson's a big advocate, but this was 2 legislative sessions ago that it was brought before them and they shot it down. It wasn't last legislative session. So I don't know if they're going back. I haven't heard lately, you know, whether that's going to be taken before them one more time, or if they're waiting for some changes within the structure of the legislature to take it back. They're not really receptive to progressive ideas right now, so.
Because I know there has been talk about B corporations being so.
Yeah. Yeah, so, you know, the time will come, and the group that actually started the drive on that one, and I don't know if it was Rural Dynamics as much as it was Tom Jacobson, I know was a part of the committee that introduced that bill, and he's the CEO of Rural Dynamics, so he wrote the paper on behalf of that, because that is an organization that probably would benefit from the L3C status.
How about the Montana Nonprofit Association? Are they involved?
They are an association, and I think probably would be okay staying as a nonprofit because they're not really revenue generating.
No, I mean in terms of lobbying.
Oh, yeah, they were behind it as well. Yeah, absolutely behind it. There's just a lot of benefits to it, and I think it just takes nonprofits and for-profits to a whole other level.
And to clarify, donations made to an L3C are or are not tax deductible?
So if you make an outright gift to an L3C, you don't get that tax write-off. That's where it's really more beneficial to be an investor than it is to be.
They're not tax exempt.
They're not tax exempt in that sense. There's a lot of property tax exemptions that they benefit from, but not from gift tax exemptions.
Can they use a fiscal sponsor, and how long is the time frame that you can use a fiscal sponsor for?
For what was that?
Can they use a fiscal sponsor, or is that only when you have a pending 501 status?
Well, I would say when you have a pending 501c3 status, because the problem with having a fiscal sponsor, and you can use our organization, we're a nonprofit, so we cannot sponsor a for or even a hybrid for-profit. It has to be another social cause type organization. And so that, I don't think we would be able to get a fiscal sponsor for a L3C. You probably would be better off either establishing a nonprofit or a for-profit with the hope that when that gets approved here in the state of Montana, you can migrate over to the other side.
Thank you.
It's a pretty, I just really got absorbed into understanding how L3Cs work because I do think it is taking, kind of the best of both worlds. As nonprofits, we enjoy the privileges of not having to pay any taxes at all. I have a fleet of trucks, including semis and tractor trailers, and I pay no property taxes on any of those. So, imagine taking your $300 or $400, a year registration for a nice SUV, and then take that semi. I can't even imagine. Thousands of dollars would be our registration on that if we had to pay property taxes. We do have to file taxes. They're called a 990. If you have revenue more than $25,000, I think is the threshold still. You still have to file taxes. So it's not saying you are totally not scrutinized by the IRS, but you don't pay property taxes. Anything else?
I'm not completely sure of the structure of how the Montana Food Bank Network receives donations or how you guys get your food items. Could you kind of walk through
Sure.
Montana Food Bank Network? How you guys are?
All right. We are a member of the Feeding America Network, which is the national organization. And that is one access point for us for food. They get food donated from all these national chains, Tyson, Frito-Lay, those types of things, those big organizations will commit to donating to or food banks that are within this nationwide network. And they post all this up literally on we've got a morning session and an afternoon session, and I have an operations officer, but that's what he does, is sit in front of the computer, and he bids on loads. So they'll get a donation, let's just say, of a whole truckload full of soup from Campbell's. And they'll put that up there, and they will say, we get allocated so many points every week based on our budget size. And we can bid those points against those loads. And then all we have to do is cover transportation. So if there's a truckload of soup in LA, might be about $3,000 for the entire truckload, and that truckload typically has a retail of about $52,000. So we can bid points, not pay the $52,000, and just pay the shipping. So that's one way we get our food. We also have a budget that we actually outright buy food. So we have food brokers that we work with. And so we'll pay like wholesale prices, typically, like what a grocery store would do if they were to go out and buy on the wholesale market. So that is one way that we do it. We also get outright donations. And again, they come through the Feeding America Network. Somebody might say, hey, we just want to give this truckload. We had that with Tyson Foods not too long ago, where Huey Lewis, who has got a place here in Montana, was golfing with the CEO from Tyson Foods. And he's a big advocate of food banks, and said something about, hey, you need to make this donation. And needless to say, we just had a flush of chickens that came through like 6 months later, and all the food banks got 2, 3, 4 truckloads, semi-loads full of chickens. So that was obvious. That was wonderful. So, there's just good things that happen all the time. So, so that's another angle. And then, of course, just outright donations from grocery stores. We do a program called Grocery Rescue, where we work with a lot of chain grocery stores where we go and pick up food that's their best by, sell by dates. They're still good food. They just can't keep them on their shelves anymore. So we allot that way. And then, you hear about food drives, and the local food banks do them, we do them. So you have to get really, really creative and very innovative in the number of ways that you get your food. We have, we did about 8 million pounds distribution last year. So it's a pretty hefty distribution throughout the state. And that all stuff comes from someplace. Does that give you some picture? Yeah. It's quite a, I had no idea when I was coming into the food banking business what it was going to entail. It is not your mother's nonprofit, that's for sure. It's a grocery business, and you're dealing with transportation, you're dealing with bargaining, you're dealing with wholesale pricing, and there's all kinds of creative things that come through it. Anything else? All right, thank you.